Good afternoon. It's a warm Sunday afternoon in Colombo. This is Samya Ashok reporting for ThePrint. With me today is a former commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, Ambika Satkunanathan. Welcome, ma'am. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I'd like to start by just asking you more generally about how you see the mood today. Today, I think, is almost the 36th or 37th day of the protest, if I'm right. Uh, what is the mood like in Colombo? You've seen the swearing in of a new prime minister 2 days ago. You're going to see a no confidence motion on Tuesday. Out on the streets right now at the Go Home protest, what are things looking like?
I think generally the mood is one of there is a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of economic anxiety because, for instance, we have no reserves. There are continuing and longer fuel queues. There are kerosene queues. There are gas queues. So there's a lot of fear and anxiety. There's also, I suppose, anger.
Right.
Because people feel their demands have not been, particularly the go home Gota demand, which is for the president to step down. Those demands have not been heeded. There's also quite a bit of debate, discussion about whether the appointment of Ranil Wickremesinghe as the Prime Minister is the correct thing, and some people saying this is a pragmatic option, don't rock the boat, whereas others saying, well, there's no need to appoint him, they could have appointed Sajid Premadasa, or the president could have stepped down and he didn't choose to do that. And economics, yes, we do need solutions for that immediately, like right now, but that doesn't mean that we should ignore the other issues, that we can also take them both forward. We can pay attention, and I think that's a very pertinent argument because in Sri Lanka's history, it's always been, let's tackle this now and deal with that later. But the later has never come, and this, in a sense, is a unique moment because the protests have been they've been organic. Not controlled or organized by political parties or trade unions, although trade unions have also protested in March.
Right.
The general public have, and even then it's some of the GotaGoGama can't be compared to, for instance, the people protesting in the suburbs of Colombo asking for gas to cook with.
Yes.
But there are all sorts of protests. The common demand, of course, is for the president to step down. I wouldn't say that there are other common demands. That is the only common demand, and that to date has not been met.
Sure, and I think one interesting observation I've made when I was wandering around the site is a really like a large group of folks who've come together from completely diverse backgrounds. So I noticed a very political inter-university student federation, soldiers who lost their limbs in the civil war. You had professionals come in, you had artists, you had Rastafarians, so on and so forth. The problem with that, in some respects, is this leaderless sort of one person following, giving orders to what to do next, could also cause a lot of confusion. So, for the purposes of Indian viewers, we've had our big movements before, and we've always tried to find who is that person who's leading. Is there a lot of politics involved in putting together something like this? And as an observer living in Colombo, what have you found the last 1 month to be like in terms of the way this plays out?
The space is interesting, diverse, and you see differences like from the first week when you start going later to today. There are differences. So, for instance, the initial days you really did not see people with overtly Tamil symbols, like with the Portus. You really did not see. But then you went, because the Tamils also, there was initial reluctance to take part in this. It's because also of if we participate, the state will crack down. Or fear of these large, massive crowds also due to past experiences with violence. The thought that, we've been fighting and struggling, our lives are a struggle, so now you guys need to take this forward. It's a combination of a lot of things. And of course, for me, the leaderless protest is really not a problem.
Right.
That's probably the strength. Because in Sri Lanka and in South Asia, but particularly also in Sri Lanka, we have this notion that of a savior, of someone who's going to save the country, and that has also been our downfall. And I believe you cannot. Real change comes from the ground up. It comes from collective action. One person can really do only so much.
Yeah.
And you do need systems and processes and institutions in place which we don't have. So no one's really going to come and save us. So the fact that it is so diverse is a positive thing, but it can also have unseen consequences. So, for instance, we have seen people trying to claim it, or others saying certain political parties are trying to claim it. We have seen someone presenting demands and saying these are demands of 200 or so plus groups and individuals, and yet there are others who are here who have come out and said, well, it's not all because we have not signed up to this.
Right.
You have seen another group which supposedly has links to a political party presenting demands. Yet again, they're going to present to all political leaders saying they are from the protest. But of course, not everyone is part of it. But I believe that for what is happening now, this awakening of civic consciousness, civic responsibility, and busting that myth of protests being, particularly the middle classes. It's like you don't go out onto the road and protest. Like going out onto the road is such a demeaning thing, and you do not, respectable people do not do that. That kind of attitude has been busted.
Right.
That I think is really great. And so for that, I feel that it's okay. The confusion is okay. The messiness is okay, because democracy is supposed to be messy, complicated. We don't want to deal with the complexity, right? And we also don't want to have any responsibility, which is why we always prefer one person. Because then you put it all on the person,
Right.
and then we don't have to really participate, and you sit back and let it happen. But the fact that people want to is positive.
So in a sense, this actually makes things more interesting in trying to keep that cohesive attitude going. I think as an observer, again, as a journalist walking around the space, one thing that keeps coming up as a word is unity. We've seen unity amongst ethnic groups, religious groups. You have religious people there. You see nuns and monks and so on. But somebody told me 2 days ago how even 2 years ago, Sri Lanka was deeply divided along religious lines. And today we see sort of like a unity amongst the Buddhists, the Sinhalese, the Tamils. Do you think that's how you portray, you see it as well? And also, is it a sustainable unity, right? You're coming together based on an economic situation. Stomachs are hungry, fuel tanks are empty. But is this something that you think the solidarity will go beyond this event in history?
I would see it as I said in the piece I wrote, was published today, I don't see unity as it's conceived here. So yes, you have seen religious leaders coming here. Personally, I am a secular person, so to see religious leaders in any political space really makes me very uncomfortable, particularly because Sri Lanka has given prime place to Buddhism, a special place to Buddhism in its constitution. We've had a Sinhala Buddhist national state, which is the root cause of the ethnic conflict and the 30-year war. And some of the Buddhist priests who come here are people who espoused racism, who built their brand on racism.
That's interesting.
So when they turned up here, people were like, what are they doing here? I am not for chasing people away, because that means we are also becoming authoritarian and cutting and like restricting rights. But I am for those who are there, asking them questions, putting them on the spot, asking them to acknowledge past racism, take responsibility, say where you are in relation to those issues.
Yeah.
Then it is more sincere, it is more acceptable. And of course, if you look at the history of the armed conflict, the Catholic, the Christian Catholic clergy have played an important role in protecting human rights in the North and the East. They have safeguarded people. They have intervened in times of crisis. They have definitely done that. And because of that, within particularly the Catholic Church, there's been a divide between the North and East versus the South.
Right.
Because the leaders or the head of the church in the South have not been particularly supportive of what these people, the priests and nuns, did in the North and the East. So they have played that role, and we cannot deny it. But I think Sri Lanka's history really is in secularism. And that is what I would say, and where unity is concerned, unity is always meant in Sri Lanka, divest your ethnic or religious identity and embrace an identity which they say is Sri Lankan, but actually based on its singular Buddhist identity. And that's the problem. I don't think even now people coming together, the issues they're not taking up, the issues of ethnic conflict, war crimes. But the positive I see is there is a space now.
Yeah.
Because of the military coming here, we can talk about militarization.
Sure.
Right? And not so much backlash, and they themselves are concerned. And they're like, why do the tanks have fuel when we have to stand in fuel queues for 3, 4, 5, 6 hours, right? The military takes up 14.9% of our national budget. If you're talking about going to the IMF package and austerity measures, I would say cut that, but there is also a problem there. Because you can cut the wastage. There's also a lot of financial mismanagement where the military is concerned. If you look at the Auditor General's reports, those mismanagement and possibly corruption is all there. So those are things you really need to go into and cut down. But at the same time, the military also employs a large number of Sinhalese. So demobilization has to be done. But you also cannot just get them out, cut them off, because then they're out of a job. Then you have more people who can't feed their families, right? That is also a problem, which shows once again that the previous good governance government, when it had the opportunity to do this properly, right, they did not do it. So we're right now in this stuck between the devil and the deep blue sea place. So I would say yes, there is space to talk about those issues. So that I think is we don't have unity yet. The unity now is along superficial lines, but there is definitely space opened up to talk about the issues that prevent this unity that we want.
Right. And again, coming back to, I guess, the core point of human rights that we're speaking about as well, of also what is it that is owed to us as humans and the dignity and the respect that comes with it. This week we're going to see on May 18th the Mullaitivar Remembrance Day. Can you tell us a bit about it? And largely, so today's, sorry to interrupt, to add to that, today's Vesak, the Buddhist festival, and when I was roaming around the protest site this morning, I saw this again. They talked about making lanterns together from different faiths and so on. But when it comes to these kinds of specific issues about Tamils, something that is important and a remembrance day that needs to be acknowledged, do you see a larger support that comes around from other ethnic groups, other religious groups? And secondly, we saw in the media recently that there was some talk about using the curfew in a way to stop people from gathering. So do you see a situation on May 18th where perhaps there will be a curfew not allowing people to actually acknowledge the day and do what is necessary to remember those who are departed?
The 18th of May, I think for Tamils, it's tragic, it's historic, it's important, because that marks the end of the war. And that is the day that you saw all these people crossing over from the LTT controlled areas via the Mullevarkal Bridge to army controlled areas. And remembering that has been difficult, particularly during the Rajapaksa era before. It was very difficult to have public events. There was militarization in the north and the east, a climate of fear, surveillance, intimidation by military intelligence. And when the good governance government came to power, that was when you could start openly. But even then, it was not possible, because there was one incident the very first year that they tried to do it, and the military tried to crack down. And I remember I was at the Human Rights Commission. We wrote a letter to the president reiterating the importance of it. We made it public. And then, of course, the government also said, yes, of course, you can commemorate. And they were allowed to. And then afterwards, yes, there was still a little bit of rumbling, but people were generally able to. But it was not completely 100% easy. Let's not make it seem it was even during Yahapalana. But still, people did it. And also the differences during Yahapalana, the good governance regime, people pushed back. They would come and complain to the commission, Human Rights Commission. We would inquire into it, and then the harassment would stop. So people felt they could speak out without fear.
Right.
That definitely changed post-November 2019. And also because of COVID, the last 2 years, the COVID regulations have been used to crack down not only on this, but also on other demonstrations, protests by the families who disappeared. I heard that someone in the north is, or last night, usually it comes much earlier, but just yesterday received a court order banning her from going, participating in the events, right? Usually it comes much earlier, a week earlier. So they've been a bit lax this time, perhaps because of all the problems.
Right.
And so we are yet to see what will happen in terms of solidarity. We have not seen that. But what I am hoping, and one of the reasons that I wrote this piece and circulated it widely, including to those some of those at the protest sites, is to ask for solidarity and to say this is the moment. You need to show solidarity, find ways to do it.
Actually, tell us a little bit about the piece that you wrote. If you can briefly tell us what it was about.
Yeah, it was tracing the because many of the younger protesters are really not aware of also what happened in 2009. And everything about the conflict is only about the LTTE. So I said, well, Tamils were protesting well before the LTTE and experienced state violence for it. Tamils are protesting well after the LTTE and still experiencing state violence for it. So the problem is the state. And the reason that even now the state is able to act with such impunity and use violence and abuse the law against the protesters is because they were allowed to act with impunity then. So if we want to counter violence, state violence is where we need to start. And also a little bit about why May 18th is important and why they need to show solidarity, because if we want unity, that is where we must start. And by acknowledging these violations, by making these demands also everyone else's demands, not just the Tamils' demands, right?
Yeah.
And that is how you get the unity through truth, justice, and equal citizenship. So I said, well, one of the ways, to counter state violence is demand accountability for grave violations of humanitarian and human rights law. Demand demilitarization. Demand that the violations be acknowledged. And that people are allowed to memorialize. That is one way of countering it. So, we hope that there will be something at these different protest sites to show solidarity, because I think showing solidarity is definitely one way of countering state violence and countering and maybe busting the myth and the dominant hegemonic narrative that they're trying to construct.
Right.
But of course, they might not declare curfew, but right now we have a state of emergency in place that was declared on the 6th. Emergency regulations were issued. Those are very problematic because they restrict a number of rights and give additional powers to the military. Also, the emergency regulations have to be passed by Parliament within 14 days. If not, they lapse. If they're passed within 14 days, then they are in effect for a month. And at the end of each month, they have to be voted on again.
Okay.
So there is a debate in Parliament. Parliament convenes on the 17th. So we're hoping that there will be a debate, there will be a vote, and they will vote against it. Because what is the need for the state of emergency? And the most important thing to note is when the state of emergency was in place, the supporters of the regime were allowed to coolly walk all the way from the Prime Minister's office to Gulf-Face to beat up protesters brutally, to destroy tents. All this that was allowed under a state of emergency.
Right.
Which then puts the credentials of this government, which claims to be a law and order government, says that it beat terrorism and it has the military in the north and east to prevent terrorism from rearing its head again.
Yes. Right. And last question that I have for you would be about what we see, I guess, everywhere in the world, right? The sort of disconnect between the ruling class, between the elites, between the upper class of society and the oppressed sections. And we see this a lot in India, that it truly feels like two completely different worlds. And when it is something like this, like an economic crisis that affects everyone, is when you truly understand how somebody else has lived almost constantly. That's been their life. It is affecting us when it comes to power cuts and lack of fuel. What is the dynamics here in Sri Lanka? You mentioned before that these protests, one thing it's changed is some folks who said, that's not for me, these protests I won't take to the streets, have actually had to show up. So how has that dynamic shifted? And do you see a a more empathetic sort of outcome out of this?
Well, interesting question. Mm, the disconnect, yes, the disconnect is there, but it's also a lack of empathy. And one of the things about the protests, I think it's important to note, and you will see when you go during the daytime more than when you go during the night, is the number of unhoused people who are there, who come there because it's a safe place for them to sleep and they get 3 meals a day. That is really sad. In a way, it's positive because yes, there is a space, but the fact that this is what people have to resort to, and the poverty is stark. Go there between like 10 a.m. to 1 p.m., 2 p.m. is when you see this the most. That is heartbreaking. But at the same time, what it shows is the terrible failure of the state. Because if this initiative, which is entirely citizen driven, entirely driven or by donations, is able to provide this to someone who has no home, who has no food, then at the state, what has the state been doing? Right. And why can't the state do this? So where this protests were concerned, the interesting thing is as soon as the Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe was appointed, immediately many people who were for the protest changed. But it's like, okay, he's the man for us because he's a professional, he knows how to work it, he's got good contacts outside the country, he can get us out of this economic crisis. Everyone be quiet. Do not ask for the president to step down, do not criticize his appointment, and all that comes back.
Yeah.
And it's like we shouldn't talk about it. So then the danger also is when we go to the IMF and we get the austerity package. Excuse me. It's like, where are they going to be cut?
Yeah.
Where are the cuts going to be? Because there are so many sections of society, like daily wage earners, like the urban poor or the low income groups in urban areas in particular, the farmers who have been been adversely affected by this disastrous policy of overnight organic farming.
Yeah.
All of them. How will they survive? Inflation is skyrocketing. I read somewhere that yesterday they had announced vegetables had increased 100% in price. And the last time I looked, I think food inflation was like 40-something% and general inflation was 29 or something. How will people survive?
Right.
And people who say austerity, I think it's a complete callousness. Austerity, yes, but why don't we start with cutting down on all the luxury vehicles the MPs have? Why don't we start by cutting down on the waste that the military? What about all those vanity projects? What about all those supposedly highway projects? Because you know what? They can wait. But 3 meals a day can't wait. So we can see the shift, that whole thing about the elite. Oh, now that Ranil Wickremesinghe has been appointed, you can definitely see that shift of telling all of us, pipe down now.
Right. Thank you so much for your time. This has been a pleasure to talk with you, and keep in touch.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. This is Samya Ashok reporting for ThePrint from Colombo.